Hello friends, today we are talking about the birth of tragedy, and this is the first video of this little mini series that I'm titling Nietzsche November, where each week we're going to discuss one of his books, the themes, the core concepts, all of that, and more importantly how they all tie together as far as a kind of overall Nietzschean philosophy or perspective. With all that said, before we get into the book itself, I do want to make clear this is not a perfect reading. I do not come from an academic background. I'm not a Nietzschean scholar. There's way better resources out there on YouTube in podcast form that do a deeper dive, a better exploration of this book that already exist. So I'm not going to try to make this video a lecture. It is purely my interpretation, my thoughts. I will go through some of my analysis of the book and some of the core themes. But at the end of the day, this is my take on it. And the whole idea behind the series is for it to be a back and forth. So with all that said, this isn't going to be a lecture. It's going to be my thoughts, my interpretations, the quotes that stood out to me. And I would love to hear you guys respond back to me, share your thoughts on the book in the comments section down below. Also, all the page numbers I reference and the translation I'm using is from this Penguin edition, which I'll link down in the description. With all that said, let's dig into the birth of tragedy. So, a few intro points to discuss or things to consider when you begin this book is that it is Nietzsche's first published work, published in 1872, and the premise of the book really exists between two different concepts. He's exploring the origin of tragedy, hence the name The Birth of Tragedy, and how it originates out of the spirit of music was basically a subtitle of the book for a while, and specifically within the Greek tradition. Okay, so kind of that Hellenistic era of Greek culture. How and why did tragedy originate? And so he's looking at that, and also how tragedy kind of operates as a solution, a cure, an alleviation of our metaphysical suffering. So you also have this whole metaphysical existence, this why do we suffer, how should we view suffering and our own existence, also playing out within this as well. So it's not purely a look at art, music, and Greek culture, but you also have this, metaphysical claim and exploration going on in the work as well. Now, with that said, it's important to note that Nietzsche was very interested in Greek philosophy. Kind of is part of the game with Western philosophies. You got to understand primarily the Socratic dialogues and beyond, but even pre-Socratics, as we know, Nietzsche was very into Pythagoras and Heraclitus, all those pre-Socratics. So you need to understand that influence because a lot of the topics, the concepts, the plays he brings up in the story build off of that. And I'll say, honestly, I'm not very experienced or well-versed with ancient Greek philosophy completely. I've read some of it. I haven't read all of it. And then also, more importantly, I haven't really read any of the Greek plays. I don't know a ton about the playwrights, about Sophocles and Euripides and all these characters or individuals that are referenced in this book. I'm not super familiar with it. I do know of the story of, the Odyssey and Odysseus, but even that's quite hazy. I read excerpts in middle school and high school, but I don't really have a full, deep, contextual understanding of all those Greek plays and that ancient culture. So that's something to keep in mind. It will be helpful to add some of that context if you do a little bit of background research with some of those stories. The other important influence that you see within Nietzsche's work, really throughout all of his books, but specifically this initial one, is Arthur Schopenhauer's metaphysical claims, basically. Essentially, the way that Schopenhauer views the world as will and representation and how he lays it out in this book right here is a lot of Nietzsche's perspective in his early writings, and you see it all over this book, how he views the world as illusion or representation, and how he views music and this Dionysian impulse being the will and the thing in itself, the inner core, the kernel of the truth, all of that. So it's really helpful, not necessary, I would say, to read Arthur Schopenhauer's work, but fortunately I read this immediately before I started this whole Nietzsche series, so extremely helpful. If you do have the time, if you do have the chance, read excerpts from this, if not read the whole thing. I really enjoyed the book. But with that said, case in point is that it's important to understand Schopenhauer's labels in terms of the will, representation, sublime or the sublimity, his view of music and art, because Nietzsche essentially adopts a lot of the same beliefs and then transforms them a little bit. And obviously later in Nietzsche's career, he turns against his mentor of Schopenhauer a lot, or at least, his hero of Schopenhauer. He turns against him a lot in a lot of ways later in his work. But at this time, you see Schopenhauer all over this work. You see the Greeks, and the last influence you see is Nietzsche's good friend, again, at the time, of Richard Wagner, who was a composer, a German composer at the time, had massive influence as a composer, and was kind of the successor of Beethoven and a lot of these great German musicians and composers of the time. And the last piece of information that would be helpful for context would be a brief understanding of Greek mythology, specifically of the god Apollo and the god Dionysius. So with all that said, let's start to explore the novel itself. Now, I took a ton of notes, tabbed the hell out of this thing, so I'm going to be referring to some of these notes that I wrote in the book. Also, I took and transferred all my notes into Notion, so I'm going to be a little bit back and forth, and I'll also just kind of riff off my mind as well. So early on, we get introduced to these two competing forces, or impulses, if you will, between the Apollonian and the Dionysiac. The Apollonian, and if you think of the god of Apollo, really represents order and structure and form. And he describes it particularly as dream. And he uses that because for him, again, connecting to Schopenhauer's metaphysical perspective of the world, reality as we experience it, especially through the Apollonian arts or the plastic arts, which would be sculpture and paintings and everything like that, is, again, perceived through our sensibility, through our perception. So in that way, it is pure illusion for Nietzsche. He comes at it at a very, from a perspective of idealism, which is, of course, centered in German culture and philosophy at this point. So he views it as illusion. And because it's illusion, it's also giving us this sense of individualization, or the principium individuationis. I'm going to pronounce it wrong. You're just going to have to deal with it. But it's basically the principle of individualization, which is just how I distinctify, or how I have the distinction between myself and you, or how I can distinguish my phone from another phone. It's this concept of multiplicity that Kant discusses at length. And so that's the world of the Apollon. Whereas Nietzsche views the Dionysiac as closer to being the will as it is. So the thing as it is itself, or the thing in itself. And music really represents this because it invokes this idea of, or this experience of feelings, right? We aren't perceiving our feelings, they are just immediate knowledge for us. And so in that way, it represents, and again, in a Schopenhauerian view, the will, the inner core of the thing in itself, reality, below this illusion of representation and perceptibility. So we have these two conflicting impulses that once they are kind of intertwined and woven together, that we see tragedy birthed and emerge from this. At the same time, though, the foundation of it all, the origin or the kind of innermost essence of tragedy, still relies in the Dionysian. And that's because music, again, and as he describes it, melody is the primary and universal. He says, quote, "The lyric poet needs all the stirrings of passion, and from the whisper of affection to the roar of madness." It's this, again, it's why he relates it to intoxication. It's this like overwhelming feeling and power and ability of music that is superior to language or to the Apollonian arts that aren't merged with the Dionysiac, because at the end of the day, those are just illusions. They're just images and symbols, right? And he further builds upon this by saying, quote, "For this very reason, the world symbolism of music cannot be exhaustively interpreted through language, because it symbolically refers to the primal contradiction and the primal suffering within the primal oneness, and thus symbolizes a sphere beyond and prior to all phenomena." So again, tying all this together, you have to see that Nietzsche, building off Schopenhauer's view of the world, is seeing the Apollon and sculpture and poetry without music as purely symbolic, pure imagery, or as he describes it, phenomena. But the actual essence, the thing behind the phenomena, is music. It is the will. So again, he expresses why language is incomplete because he says, quote, it can never uncover the innermost core of music, but once it attempts to imitate music, always remains in superficial contact with it. Which is, again, building off this idea of idealism rather than believing that reality is purely material and purely material reality. It's this idea that we're always operating within reality and existence through this kind of superficial experience, because we can only experience reality through our sensibility, through our perceptions, rather than seeing the thing in and of itself. Essentially, the thing as we experience it, this book I'm holding, is acting as like a mediator for me. The thing in and of itself is unreachable for me, and it's being mediated through the sensations of touching and sight, etc. I'm hoping I'm explaining that well. I don't know if this is the place to go into deep Kantian philosophy or idealism at whole, and I honestly don't think I'm the best at explaining that. But that's generally what's going on. That's why it's important, again, to refer to how Schopenhauer views the world as will and representation. Now, before we get off track, it's important to remember, like I referenced at the beginning of this video, that there's a metaphysical claim going on here, or a metaphysical exploration of our existence and suffering, and how do we find redemption in the reality of our suffering? Because again, to build off Schopenhauer, the world in and of itself, the true reality of existence is will, right? And if you again read some of Schopenhauer, you realize that the will is blind, it's irrational, it's insatiable, it's always desiring, it's always striving, it's always becoming, never being. And because of that, that is why we suffer as human beings. We are, in Schopenhauer's view, the highest gradation, the highest objectification of the will, and so we have this consciousness and ability to suffer at the highest capability because we're aware of this constant striving. We can never satisfy the will, and I think we experience this a lot in our real life. It's that idea of once you buy, let's say, your dream house, then you want the next house. You buy a certain car, then you want the next car. You get a raise at work, then that becomes simple. You always strive for the next thing. So that's a way to kind of conceptualize and think of the will playing out in reality. It's this constant striving, and because of that, we're always suffering because we can never just be happy. We can never just be content. And I think we all can relate to that. And so that's this idea of human existence essentially as suffering. So Nietzsche tries to explore why tragedy acts as redemption. What is it about art that redeems our existence and makes life worth living? And he explains this by referencing a story from Greek mythology between King Midas and Silenus, who is a companion of Dionysius and is this demonic satyr who comes to him and says, quote, "Miserable ephemeral race, children of hazard and hardship, why do you force me to say what it would be much more fruitful for you not to hear?" Here's the key part. "The best of all things is something entirely outside your grasp. Not to be born, not to be nothing. But the second best thing for you is to die soon." So again, putting forth this existential crisis of why are we here? Why do we exist? Is there any redeeming factor, any redeeming force of nature? And for Nietzsche, it's art, and specifically music, which he later describes as he who runs the risk of longing for a Buddha-like denial of the will, which Schopenhauer is tying a lot of Buddhist philosophy and Indian philosophy into his idea, where he states that we should urge to become this will-less subject, this pure knowing subject, rather than exist and engage in this world of representation. Back to the quote, he says, "He is saved by art, and through art, life has saved him for itself." So again, really important to note that there. And later he goes down saying, "Understanding kills action. Action depends on a veil of illusion." And here's a key quote that I tabbed specifically. He says, quote, "Aware of truth from a single glimpse of it, all man can now see is the horror and absurdity of existence. Now he understands the symbolism." Oh my God. "Now he understands the symbolism of Ophelia's fate. Now he understands the wisdom of Silenus, the god of the woods. It repels him." So again, this kind of summarizes the position that Nietzsche and I guess all of us are in, is how do we justify living at all? How do we push back from Silenus's claim that it's better to not exist or to die quick. What is the justification or the redeeming position that we can take? And for Nietzsche, it's through art and through tragedy. Moving on from here, I need to bring up, because I forgot to mention it earlier, that Nietzsche views music as a direct copy of the will, and that's why we can't just have Dionysian art. We can't just be intoxicated and brought to this primal oneness, because it's too strong for us. Once we face it, we see reality for the absurdity and the suffering existence that it is, it's too strong for us. We do not want it. So that's why there has to be this interplay between the Apollonian and the Dionysian, because it's within this interplay that tragedy happens, and we can kind of tame down the Dionysian and that strong impulse and experience we're getting from music, but kind of have it at a distance, right? It's kind of like having, like, we can play with the tiger, but the tiger's still behind glass, to use some kind of metaphor there. And potentially an even better way of describing this is where Nietzsche quotes this really fascinating example, in my opinion, where he describes, if you stare at the sun and then look away, you get these light patches, right? And he describes it by saying that if we make a concerted effort to stare into the sun and turn away blinded, we have dark colored patches before our eyes as what we might call remedies. A little bit further on, he says these light patches, we might say, to heal the gaze seared by terrible night. So again, we can't stare at that terrible night. We need some kind of taming down of it. We need to tone down the intensity of the music, of the Dionysian, of the Dionysiac, all of that. With that said, then he begins to explore the death of tragedy. So we just had the birth of tragedy. Now we got to have the death of tragedy. And the death of tragedy originates from getting away from music, away from the Dionysiac, and in a way away from the will. And it becomes much more illusion and much more centered around the drama. And specific characters that he brings up are Euripides and also Socrates. And Socrates introduces this idea, and if you've read some of, again, the Platonic dialogue, Socrates and all of that, it's quite familiar. He talks about knowing thyself, and that he believes that people act from instinct, and everything that we're doing is instinctual. And with that in mind, essentially good things, all good things come through rationality, through conscious decisions, conscious actions. So with that in mind, we're not acting from a position of intoxication, from chaos, from passion that we would be from the Dionysiac. It's an imbalance that leans us too far towards the Apollonian. Too much order, too much chaos, too much order, too much structure, and not enough music. He references opera, how opera and basically the vocals start to become more emphasized in the play rather than the music itself. Again, he describes this well on page 62, where he says that the phenomenon of aesthetic Socratism, the chief law of which is more or less, quoting Socrates here, to be beautiful, everything must be intelligible, which is a better way of explaining what I was trying to earlier, that, again, everything has to come through conscious action rather than instinct, further pushing us away from the Dionysian. So what we see start to develop with Socrates, and then later into the Alexandrian or the theoretical man, is this overemphasis of logic and reasoning and science. And this isn't Nietzsche putting art as superior to science and negating science, but it's understanding the balance of both is how I would describe it. And he brings up this one phrase often in this section and further on, is this Latin phrase of do ex machina, which I hope I'm pronouncing it right. It essentially is the idea of trying to play God and turning towards machine, hence machina rather than do, meaning for God. And it's, again, through this idea that, from Socrates, that consciousness and logic and reasoning can lead us to a solution for our existence and our suffering. We can justify it through reason, through ourselves, and kind of play God in that way, rather than turning towards art and music. And this is where Nietzsche says that Greek culture starts to decline and becomes this cheerful culture that we perceive it as here in the modern day, because they turn towards knowledge, specifically the theoretical man, the Alexandrian, which I think is a clear connection to the Library of Alexandria, but also Alexandria, coming from Alexander the Great. There's a ton of cities of Alexandria, but all of that relating to this idea of knowledge and how knowledge and reasoning is our superpower and how it's going to lead us to a solution and a chance to overcome suffering. But for Nietzsche, it's art that redeems us. It's through art and through tragedy that we're able to overcome the absurdity and suffering of our existence. So that's the death of tragedy, unfortunately, but there's a rebirth of tragedy. For Nietzsche, this is a time where, if you think about when he wrote this, in the 1870s, Germany wasn't Germany yet. It was the Kingdom of Prussia, and it was Otto von Bismarck, and slowly these Germanic nations were forming together through a lot of conquest. And there wasn't a clearly defined German culture and German spirit. It was still kind of in this malleable situation. So Nietzsche describes this as an opportunity for Germany to turn back towards tragedy, turn back towards music and the beauty of it. And he thought that that would be the opportunity for Germany and the German culture to really save itself as this rebirth of tragedy, which is why he really loved Richard Wagner and his music. He thought that that was, again, part of that resurgence of this Greek culture kind of coming back in a way. So in the end, he doesn't really say for sure whether Germany reaches this state, but this is, again, he's presenting the opportunity. He's making a case that hopefully Germany and German culture can turn into this, can leverage this. That's why he's describing it. And he references that at this time, a lot of art, because of this turn towards the Apollonian, this overemphasis of explanation, rather than kind of letting music and feeling and this ravenous passion and will do the talking for the art, we get art that is just degenerated, as he says, quote, art degenerated into an entertainment of the lowest kind, and aesthetic criticism became the catalyst for a vain, distracted, selfish, and moreover pathetically unoriginal form of social companionability, goes on, etc., etc. And specifically he says, yet without myth, all culture loses its healthy and natural creative power. So for Nietzsche, myth and art is essential to culture. It's essential. It's not just entertainment. It's not just, oh, it's nice to kind of listen to music or go see a movie or, read some magazine, listen to a podcast, watch YouTube, whatever it is. Real art, which isn't always there, it's not always common, but real art, specifically tragedy, so not all forms of art, again, because a lot of forms of art, including maybe this video you're watching right now, is coming through perceptibility and your sensations, rather than music specifically. I mean, if you think about music, how many times do you listen to a song that just moves you in some inexplicable way? I mean, I think we can all agree that whether it's literature or movies or certain kind of pop culture music, it's entertaining, it's enjoyable, it might invoke some kind of emotion in us. But there's certain songs, there's certain type of music, there's a certain strong orchestra or instrumental that just moves us, right? It just seems like there's something more to it. That's kind of what Nietzsche's getting at with music. It's why he describes it again as directly a copy of the will itself. Later on, well, this is quoting Schopenhauer to be clear. And quoting Schopenhauer again, he says, music, on the other hand, provides the innermost kernel preceding all form or the heart of things. So again, both Schopenhauer and Nietzsche viewed music as this incredibly special art form. And it's through music that, quote, only from the spirit of music can we understand delight in the destruction of the individual. So without music, without the Dionysian, we are kind of lost. We're kind of stuck in this world of illusion and have no justification, or we're not really perceiving reality as it is. But again, pure Dionysian art, is too strong for us, which is why we need the tragic myth and the tragic hero, because it's through that we know it's not real when we're watching the play of Greek culture. We know that it's not real, but we're still getting the crux in the reality that is being expressed through the music, through the play, through the character. We're still getting that emitted to us. We're still taking in and finding kind of delight and, again, redemption and solace by watching this play out, rather than experiencing it directly and immediately. Again, tying back to it, we're not staring at the sun directly. We're just kind of looking at these light patches. So it's complicated for a 100-page book. I tried to tear this thing up, and this is why I said it's not going to be a lecture, because I'm doing my best to kind of conceptualize it. But it's quite interesting. It's quite interesting to, again, think about how the impact of art plays on culture. What is a culture that loses that intense depth and complexity of art and just transfers it or trades it for quick entertainment and stimuli and dopamine release? We see this today. Like, it's, instead of people really taking the time to enjoy a difficult book or listen to a really artistic, complex, riveting song, right, that really speaks to existence or pain, suffering, those sometimes inexplicable emotions that we feel in our inner self. Instead of turning towards that kind of art, people just want to swipe on TikTok. They just want to swipe on Instagram. They want the quick dopamine release. They want the content. It's quantity over quality of art. So he kind of rounds off the book by describing that the Dionysian speaks through the Apollonian, right? Through the tragic myth, through the hero, through the Apollonian art. But the Apollonian also speaks through the Dionysian, because, again, the will is being objectified through representation. So there isn't representation by itself. There isn't Apollonian art, symbolism, imagery by itself. It has to refer and imitate the will, music, the innermost, essence of things. So you get this interplay. They're very dependent upon each other, and it's kind of in the middle that the magic happens, so to speak. And I think the last quote to round this out would be page 114. He says, "For to say that life really is so tragic does not in the least help to explain the origin of an art form, provided that art is not only an imitation of the truth of nature, hence that representation and illusion, but a metaphysical supplement to that truth of nature, coexisting with it in order to overcome it." So again, it's art is our chance to accept absurdity in existence and find delight in it, or find a way to overcome it, find a reason to live, rather than turn to Silenus's position of it's rather to not exist at all. So again, that's where you see the conflicting philosophies of Schopenhauer, who would rather just not exist. Hence, he's termed or labeled the great pessimist, quite the moniker. Or then you get Nietzsche, which we'll get to in later books, the will of power, the will to power. Okay, it's a very life-affirming philosophy, rather than a life-denying philosophy. So, with all that said, looking over here at some of my notes, some of these final thoughts, I thought it was quite interesting that you have the birth of tragedy explained, you have the death of tragedy, and then you have the rebirth of tragedy. And I think it kind of reminded me of Christianity, primarily because he references it in this book, Original Sin. He talks about Prometheus falling from the gods and being condemned, all of that. And he references the Adam and Eve story. And if you think about it, Adam and Eve are in the Garden of Eden, right? It's perfect there. But then they fall from grace. They have original sin, and they're cast into like damnation essentially on earth. So we have, again, the birth of tragedy, then the death of tragedy. We fall into this lesser state. We lose the will itself. We're stuck in illusion. But then there's the rebirth, right? And for Christianity, the rebirth is Jesus. Jesus comes as the position of salvation. So I just saw a little bit of a parallel there. I don't know if there's much to say to that. Maybe I'm looking too deep into things, but I thought that was quite interesting. I also have heard when I was reading some analyses on this that Dionysian is known, or Dionysus is known as a god that would come to you at your last chance, your last hope, and he would kind of save you at the last moment. And I think again that's why he's referencing the decline of culture and this point of ultimate suffering that we're staring at. We're staring at our existence, and we're kind of on our last breath, our last chance of hope. Tragedy and the Dionysian and music swoops in, right? And kind of uplifts us, saves us, redeems us. So that's another kind of theme that you see within here. And then, something, again, to think about this, and this is what I always try and advocate here on this channel, is how can we relate this to our modern day? How can we relate it to real life? Because it's fun to be theoretical, it's fun to talk about all this stuff. How does it actually relate to our day-to-day? And to me, again, the first thing I think about is how important art is for culture. And we're going to be a bit subjective here, okay? Because art, by definition, is mostly subjective. But there does seem to be less attention, less admiration and affection for art these days, at least in the Western world, at least here in America. It's much more of an emphasis towards entertainment and stimuli and lust and anything in excess, rather than having this intoxication. And if you think about it too, the Apollonian is very much centered and focused on the individual, and we see that in America. It's me, 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 right? It's very much, and even beyond America, it's very much a self-oriented, self-focused, individualized world, focused on individuality. Who am I? Rather than what we get from music, from the Dionysian, by being reconnected with the will, which for Schopenhauer is ubiquitous in all things. We all share the same will. We're all kind of originating from the same thing. The more we can have more of that Dionysian experience through real, valuable art, whether it's tragedy or music, the more we can have that in culture, the more maybe we can have that idea of Bob Marley, one love. We can have that experience that you and me have something in common. Our essence is found in the same will. I don't have to look at myself as against you. And we can share this quote unquote primal oneness. I don't know. Again, there's a lot to think about. That's why I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts in the comments down below. So drop me a like, drop me a comment, give me a paragraph, give me a sentence, whatever you want to share. Hopefully you guys had a chance to read through this so that you can explore this with me. The next book is The Gay Science. So I'd love for you guys to follow along. So look out for that next week. We're going to explore a lot of the concepts in there. The whole God is dead, madman thing, eternal reoccurrence, and a whole lot more within that book. It's quite fascinating. So if you can, read those sections I referenced in my previous video explaining the whole Nietzsche series. Again, share with me your thoughts in the comments down below. I'd love to go back and forth, see what I got wrong, see what you guys are thinking. And until the next one, subscribe for more content like this, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.